All right, we are back again for another episode. I am Robert Doc Barham, and I'm here with my good friend and co-host, Mr. Ben Cooke. Ben, are you there?
Hello.
There you are. And today we have a special guest. I'm really excited. I have wanted to have an interview and a conversation with Paul Smith for many, many, many years. And Paul, are you there?
I am.
Hey, I'm really happy that you called in today and that you're going to be our guest on the program today. Thanks so much for being here.
No, I'm happy to finally find a window that we could get it together.
That is actually more true than we know. Paul, you are a former member of the United States military, and you were involved in the remote viewing unit that was at Fort Meade, Maryland. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you are still a remote viewer and remote viewing instructor. Is that right?
That is also right.
All right. Could you, for our audiences who, and I did a little questioning around town recently, asking people if they knew what remote viewing was. And I don't know if I was put up to some sort of a gag or not, but some of them seem to think it had something to do with television controlled devices. Can you explain to our audience what exactly remote viewing is?
Well, I don't know about exactly, but I can come pretty close.
Good.
So, of course, remote viewing today is used also in technical terms for what you do with an internet and a webcam. Oftentimes, if you put in, like in Google search, you put in remote viewing, it'll come up with Zoom opportunities or whatever. And in fact, that's a new use for the term. The original use for the term remote viewing refers to an ESP or psychic-based skill that the military developed during the Cold War. And they used it to spy on the Soviets or the Hezbollah or narco-traffickers or whoever the bad guys happened to be at a given time. So basically, remote viewing is a way of using one's consciousness to perceive and describe locations, events, persons that are separated from you, the viewer, by space or time or shielding. Now, what does that mean? That means, for example, if the U.S. military needed to find out what the Russians were up to in a facility on the far side of the Ural Mountains, they might task a remote viewer to remote view the building it's in and then go inside, putting little scare quotes around go, at least essentially projecting. The viewer would project his or her consciousness inside the building and try and perceive what was going on there and report back. So that's both distance and shielding. You can get through, remote viewing doesn't seem to be stoppable by any kind of known shielding. You can perceive through walls, you can perceive through cement, you can perceive through lead, whatever it might be. In fact, you can even perceive through Faraday cages and electromagnetic shielding, such things as that. It also works actually across time. We do have some success remote viewing future events, and we have demonstrated numerous times in controlled circumstances remote viewing past events as well. So it is basically a form of extrasensory perception that is disciplined and conditioned by which you can use it practically and solve practical problems.
So when you say extrasensory perception, would you define that or give your definition for it? Most people, I think, assume that it means psychic, but we're taught that we have 5 essential senses, right? Visual, auditory, kinesthetic, right, olfactory, gustatory. Mm-hmm. And when people talk about extrasensory perception, talk about something that is beyond that. Yeah. But remote viewing...
People get confused. People get confused by the term extrasensory perception. And it is a form of what's popularly known as being psychic. Actually, being psychic is a form of extrasensory perception. So oftentimes when you hear ESP or extrasensory perception, people will often assume, oh, you mean you have a 6th sense or a 7th sense. That's not what it means at all. What it means is, in fact, extra in the same sense as extramarital, extracurricular, extraterrestrial, whatever. It means outside of or away from whatever the term is that extra is applied to. So if it's extracurricular, that means it's outside of your school. If it's extraterrestrial, it means it's outside of the Earth. Extrasensory means it functions without the senses being involved. It happens outside of the physical senses. So essentially, you are perceiving, as you would if your senses were involved, you're perceiving something, but it's bypassing the senses in some way that, of course, makes mainstream scientists freak out. It's a non-physicalist kind of way of experiencing things perceptually. And when we were using the military, it didn't always work. We admit that. But there were times when it absolutely did work, and we have incontrovertible evidence that it worked.
So, all right, I'm going to go back, if we could, for just a second to that extrasensory perception. When I've been interested in this topic for, I think I remember seeing there was an episode of Nightline with Ted Koppel back around
November 30th, 1995.
Right. And there were remote viewers on that episode, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
there was one.
Who was that?
That was Joe McMoneagle.
It was Joe.
Now, there were also people involved with the remote viewing program who weren't themselves remote viewers.
Okay. They were on that episode as well.
Yes.
Okay. So I definitely remember seeing that particular episode, and I'd already been learning about remote viewing, and I was really interested in the topic. But when you say extrasensory perception, you do, what is the process by which, or how does the information or the data that you perceive, how is it translated into sensory data?
Well,
does that make sense what I'm saying?
Well, sort of. If we knew the answer to that question, we wouldn't be having all the pushback from scientists. We don't know how it works. So essentially, you've got the viewer, and they perceive things like normal people. You have the target, which, let's say it's that factory on the other side of the Ural Mountains, and somehow awareness of what is involved in going on in that factory is able to transcend that distance between the factory and the viewer is able to perceive it as if he or she, approximately as if he or she were actually perceiving it sensorially. What I think happens, and I'm going to use the term here, non-local. So, when we talk about causation, in other words, one thing causes a number, you have an event that is brought to pass by some preceding cause. We talk about causation, we have what's normally called local causation. What that means is you have an event, and then through a traceable series of other events, you come with the final effect of that. So the billiard ball example is very popular, where you use your cue stick, the cue stick strikes the cue ball rolls over, hits one billiard ball, that billiard ball rolls over, hits another one, and knocks it in the pocket. That's an example of local causation, a very simplistic version.
Right.
It gets very, very complex. I mean, if you use, like, drones are very much in the news today. If you have a drone flying and you have a radio transmitter controlling it, the radio signal actuates mechanisms within the drone to make it fly wherever you want and do whatever you want. That's a form of local causation as well, even though there's a long distance between you and the drone. There's this continuous causal link between you and the drone, which involves the radio signal and the actuators on the drone and all that kind of stuff. Okay? So that's our standard form of causation. That's the only causation that mainstream science believes in. But there's this other version called non-local causation, which is you can have a cause in one location, you can have an effect in another location, and there is no traceable physical chain of events between the two. There is no local causal chain. It's like, here's the cause, and here's the event, and poof, it happens. So that's the kind of thing we're dealing with in remote viewing and other kinds of extrasensory perception. You have the target, you have the viewer's perception of the target, you have no idea, and nothing physical seems to be applying here. You have no idea how the information gets from one place to the other. Okay? And so the question you ask, it doesn't at the moment have an answer. Now people are trying to figure it out. They wonder if that's something to do with this unusual consequence of quantum physics called quantum entanglement or quantum non-locality,
Right.
because, and that's where, of course, we borrow the term non-local from. In that case, there is actually a kind of a cause and a kind of effect that happens over distance with no linking causal chain. And physics has proved that to be true both through experiment and through mathematical modeling and such.
Is this you're in part referring to entanglement?
Yes.
Quantum
They're two different
entanglement?
terms for the same thing.
Is that also known as spooky action at a distance?
Yeah, so that's what Einstein called it, because he didn't like it. In fact, he kind of rejected
Einstein.
the idea that it existed. Huh?
Well, I was just joking. Go ahead.
Yeah. So Einstein was presented with this concept. In fact, he and two of his colleagues wrote a paper that kind of defined this thing, this quantum entanglement, quantum non-locality. And then he didn't like it because he also said he didn't believe that God played dice with the universe, right?
Uh-huh.
And it's kind of that kind of thing. And it kind of freaked him out. He called it spooky action at a distance because, again, there is a result and there is an action and there's no linking causal chain. And that just goes against almost everything in physics, except this is provable mathematically and physically in actual experiments. There's some hope that someday maybe we'll figure out what that link is in terms of remote viewing, but so far we haven't succeeded.
So, Paul, I'm curious, what kind of verification process do you have for remote viewing? There's obviously skeptics out there. If you're sort of peeking in at this factory on this side of the Ural Mountains, how do you know you're right?
Yeah, well, we'll back off from that for the moment because we may not ever get ground truth from the Russians, right? But it's kind of like, how do you know if you've ever actually perceived something in just regular life? The only way to tell is to see what you have what you describe as having perceived and compare it to what it is you're supposed to have perceived. So, for example, if you get someone who has been blind and can't see anything, and then somehow there's this miraculous surgery that restores their sight, and all of a sudden they can see. The only way you know they can see is by their reaction to the descriptions of what they're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
So if you say, okay, what do you see? And they say, well, I see this round red shape, and you're holding up a red ball. I see a round red shape. You know they actually saw it, right? That's the only way you can tell. There's no measurement device that measures how much perception a person has achieved, right? It's basically on self-report and description and comparison to ground truth. And so that's the way it is remote viewing. You assign someone, let's say, to remote view the Eiffel Tower. Now, in remote viewing, the viewer has to be blind to the target. The viewer is not allowed to know what the target is. And anyone who is associated with the viewer is not allowed to know what the target is either. We do not want the viewer getting information about the target through normal means. We need to make it so that it's airtight, that the only way they can get information is through this ESP psychic-based channel, okay? So the viewer is totally blind to the target. Everyone associated with the viewer is totally blind to it. Nobody knows what the target is consciously.
So the roles in a remote viewing...
Wait a second, I'm not done.
Okay.
I'm not done. So what happens is you give the viewer a target, and we use an arbitrary number that conveys no information. So the one I like to use is 8675309. Okay? We say that's an arbitrary number, conveys no information about the target, but it's
That's
linked
Tommy
to...
Tunes number?
Tommy Two-Tone, yeah. So, yeah. So 8675309, and it's linked to the task, which is remote view the Eiffel Tower. The viewer is not given the task. The viewer is not told this remote view the Eiffel Tower. The viewer is given 8675309, and their subconscious has to go out into the universe and find out what the linkage is before the viewer can then address the target. Okay? So they're blind. They're totally blind. They describe the Eiffel Tower. They say, well, it's this tall metallic structure with crisscrossing girder elements. It tapers upwards. It's very tall. It's a national landmark. It has the feel of being overseas. I get the impression of France. And they may do a sketch that closely resembles the Eiffel Tower. Okay, well, if they did not know what the target was and there was no way that any information was leaked to them, if they produce a sketch and a description that matches the Eiffel Tower rather than the middle of the Atlantic Ocean or the or the White House or something like that, if it just matches the Eiffel Tower, you have very good reason to believe they truly perceived that through some kind of non-local means.
I see. Well, there's a story I'd like to share that relates to this. When I was very young, my dad was he was the kind of guy who went to the library and came home with several books and put them in a basket next to his chair and read them. And I, as a curious son, checked on those books to see what they were. And often my
Some would
dad,
call that nosy.
well, this was in the family room, so it was okay to do that.
Okay.
And he invited me to. My dad was really, really supportive of me being a voracious reader and reading widely and deeply. And he periodically came home with books that were on topics that were in this area: paranormal, reincarnation, psychic ability, things like that. Well, there was a year where we went on summer vacation down to Virginia Beach. And at one point, he said, let's go over to the Edgar Cayce Institute of Research and Enlightenment. I'd never been there before. And so we went over there and we went into the building, into a room. It was like a conference room. And the fella who I guess my father knew came out and he said he had a manila envelope and he put it on the table and he gave my father and myself both a piece of paper and a pen. And he said, draw what you think or write what you think is in this sealed envelope. And so I don't remember what it was that I wrote or drew, but I do remember looking over to my left and seeing my dad, and he drew a triangle, and the triangle had circles on it. And when he put his pen down and we were done, the gentleman opened up the manila envelope and he pulled out a triangular shaped Christmas card with green and red Christmas balls all hanging from it. And that I already had an interest in psychic things and all things paranormal, and that shocked me. And the interesting thing to me about that story is that many years later, I went to the Monroe Institute, and you have been there as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And when I was there, after dinner one evening, we were invited to go over to one of the other buildings. So the 25 of us, the students, went over there and sat down. And Joe, who you mentioned earlier, Joe McMonigal, who is he remote viewer number 001? Is that his number that I've read before?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And he came in, and a similar scenario happened. Someone came in with a sealed manila envelope. They put it on the table, gave him a piece of paper and a pencil, and asked him to draw what was in the envelope. And we had already been talking about remote viewing during the residential program. So I watched Joe and myself and the other ones watched him draw an arc, a very large arc, and an arch actually. And he then wrote St. Louis Arch. And they opened up the envelope, and it was a photograph of the St. Louis Arch. So now, in that particular case, would that qualify as similar to what you just described?
So which case? The case of your dad or the case of Joe McMonigal?
Both of them, or either or.
Well, they both did the same thing, didn't they? Just different targets.
Yeah, I mean, my cynical
and that's
self.
a simple, and that's a simple remote viewing experiment. In fact, in my book, The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing, I suggest that people can start with that kind of an experiment. It's something in an envelope that you don't know what it is. Get somebody else to put it in there, and then you try and sketch what you are perceiving inside the envelope without actually seeing what it is. And it's a good way to get started. And both your dad and Joe did a great job on that basic attempt.
So now, there was a part of me that went away later, or I went away later on, and I thought, that could have been a magic trick. That's pretty easy. You tell them beforehand, put the picture in there.
Yeah.
But it really is not a magic trick. It really is a teachable skill. Is that right?
That's correct. And obviously, it could be faked. That happens. It can happen. But in these cases, like with your dad and with Joe, there was no incentive to fake it. And there have been plenty of experiments that are much more sophisticated involving remote viewing that were very well controlled to prevent any kind of fraud or fakery occurring, right?
Uh-huh.
So, yeah, it's a legitimate way of getting your feet wet in this process.
Now, on the website, under the About section, which is about you, it says, and I quote, "You are the longest-serving controlled remote viewing teacher active today, and that you began as an instructor in 1984 and served for 7 years in the government Stargate remote viewing program at Fort Meade in Maryland from 1983 to 1990. And you became the only five Stargate personnel to be trained as remote viewers by the founders of remote viewing, Ingo Swann and Dr. Hal Puthoff of SRI International." Now, SRI was it's in Stanford. It was in Stanford, right?
Well, it's near Stanford, and it used to belong to Stanford. It was the research arm of Stanford University, but it was also a government supporting think tank. And so they were doing nuclear weapons research and things like that, which the Stanford student body did not like. And they forced the university to spin it off as its own nonprofit research organization. It became SRI International. And it goes through millions and sometimes billions of dollars a year doing research and such for the government and for industry.
I see. So how did what was the inception of the training? What need did it arise from?
Well, in the 60s and early 70s, the CIA discovered that the Soviets were actually spending hundreds of millions of dollars on what we would consider paranormal research. Now, if you think about that, the estimates are that the Stargate program, from beginning to end over 23 years, cost the U.S. taxpayer about $1 million a year, so roughly $25 million over that period of time. The Russians were spending $100 to $200 million a year, and the CIA needed to find out why, because they never, the Russian Soviets didn't spend money on something they weren't expecting to get some kind of bang for their buck. And so the CIA wanted to find out what's going on, and it just so happened that concurrently with that, kind of in parallel but not connected, Hal Puthoff, who you mentioned, and Ingo Swann, who you also mentioned, this is a long story, so I won't go into detail, but they, through a set of happenstances, got together and did what you would consider a remote viewing experiment that was really successful. And Puthoff, who was at SRI International, and actually a prominent and well-regarded physicist at the organization, circulated an informal paper about it, and the CIA got a hold of it and said, "Oh, this might be a marriage made in heaven. These guys are working in a classified facility that does government support work already, and so we could maybe hire them to explore this stuff that the Russians are looking into." And so they came up with a contract and paid the SRI, I think $50K was the first seed money they gave them, to research ESP as at various, but mainly it turned out to be a useful intelligence collection tool. And so it got started and went along, and then later on, the military wanted to have its own program, particularly the Army, the Intelligence Security Command, headed by a general named Bert Stubblebine. Mm-hmm. General Stubblebine felt like he wanted to be able to create his own cadre of remote viewers that wasn't dependent on SRI. So he asked them to develop a training program to where he could train ordinary soldiers how to be remote viewers. And so that's where the controlled remote viewing program came from. It was initially generated to help train military personnel, which is how I got involved. I was one of the original people who got trained in that program. And I think I answered your question there somewhere. I may not have got it all.
All right. Well, hey, we are at the moment where, and I believe, Ben, you're still with us too, right?
I'm right here.
Okay. We're at the moment where we need to take a very, very brief break, and we will be back in just a minute.
This is Radio Fairfax, free-form programming, created by the people for the people of Fairfax County, Virginia. Call us or email us, 703 888-560-TALK or Radio Fairfax at fcac.org.
Did you know that you can listen to Radio Fairfax on your smartphone, tablet, television, and many more internet-connected devices? Just download the TuneIn Radio app from your device's app store and search for Radio Fairfax. It's just that easy. The TuneIn app is available for iPhone, Android, BlackBerry, Windows Phone, and more. For more information, check out radiofairfax.org.
All right, and we are back with my friend Ben Cooke and with remote viewer and instructor Dr. Paul Smith is here. Gentlemen, are you there?
Yes.
Ben, you've been awful quiet for a little bit. You've got to jump in here.
I'm taking it all. I'm taking it all in, and I'm ready now to dial this way back as a guy who's naive about all of this and potentially skeptic. And first, Paul, I just have a kind of some basic questions for you. First of all, what am I doing right now? I'm joking. I'm joking.
You must get those kinds of jokes all the time. What color underwear am I wearing?
How did you? I want to know about you and how you got into this. How does one find their way into remote viewing? And I'm just very curious as to the genesis of all this. And then the second part of that, because I know there was a whole government program you were involved in. Well, what are you doing now? But if you could maybe start at the beginning a little bit, I'd love to hear that.
So the answer to your first question actually has changed over time, right? It started out, you didn't find it, it found you. And that's what happened to me. I had never put the words remote and viewing together in my life. I had no idea this existed. I grew up in southern Nevada, spent a lot of time in the summers working on ranches and stuff in the Rockies and round about that area. But I was always fascinated by science fiction. And I particularly found science fiction that dealt with ESP intriguing, like Andre Norton's Telepathic Cats and Zena Henderson's The People in her books Pilgrimage, and I forget the second one, and those kind of things. I found that intriguing. In junior high, I was involved in a science fair project by another one of my classmates, who also ended up going in the Army, ironically, and she became a lieutenant colonel, so she outranks me. But she had a science fair project and in ESP involving the Zener cards, or the ESP cards, with the wavy lines and the stars and circles. You see it at the beginning of Ghostbusters. And it totally failed. I had absolutely no psychic ability, apparently, and neither did anybody else. So I became a bit of a mild skeptic about it. I thought, well, it makes for great stories, but I'm not sure there's anything to it anymore. And so, I ended up going in the Army. That all is a long story. And I ended up at Fort Meade, Maryland, working as a Mideast desk officer, kind of an analytic job, focusing on Iran and the Persian Gulf area. And what I didn't know is my government quarters, I shared a wall with Skip Atwater, who was the training officer and operations officer for the remote viewing unit, and across the street from Tom McNair, who was one of the remote viewers. I had no idea what these guys did, and that was a little weird in itself, because you pretty much knew what everybody on Fort Meade did. You knew it was an intelligence discipline, and you knew which particular kind of intelligence they worked in. You might not know their targets, you may not get any information and stuff, but you knew at least they were either in signals intelligence or human intelligence or whatever, right? I didn't know what these guys were in at all, which was odd, but oh well, they weren't talking. One day they come and knock on my door, and they say, "Hey, Paul, we think you might be good at what we do." And I say, "Well, what do you do?" They said, "We can't tell you." And I said, "Well, how do I know if I'd be good at it or not?" They said, "Well, we're going to give you some tests, and if you score where we think you will, then we'll read you on and give you a chance to volunteer."
How did they know?
Well, they were looking for, there was a new contract with SRI to train a set of military viewers using this new CRV approach, controlled remote viewing approach. And the recruitment criteria from SRI was, you wanted a military officer or Army officer in intelligence. That was sort of theirs because that was their pool to draw from. An intelligence officer who was accomplished in their career. They had good report cards. They had stamped all the blocks on their dance card up to that point in their career. Well regarded in what they did, above average intelligence, which, despite what people think, that covers most of the intelligence officers in the Army. Sometimes they don't have common sense, but they were usually pretty smart. So I ticked all those boxes, but there was one more that was a crucial distinguishing factor, and that is they were looking also for people who had some kind of creative activity in their lives, because they had learned that having a creative activity was an indicator of being a little more right-brained than your average Army intelligence officer. You're a bit less of a linear thinker, and that was conducive to success with remote viewing. Well, they got to know me. They realized I had majored in art when I was going to Brigham Young University. I'd illustrated science books. I liked to do creative writing. I played guitar for, by that point, about 15, 20 years. And I was also fluent in German and competent in Arabic and Hebrew at the time, which was also an indicator. So they saw I had all these criteria.
Multilingualism?
That plays a role too, because it engages more of your brain than just your normal linguistic, alphanumeric approach, behavior. So anyway, those indicators, they said, well, we can't not try this guy out. So that's how I ended up being approached. And I scored where they needed me to. And these were not weird tests. These were like the Minnesota Multiphasic, Myers-Briggs type indicator, the more sophisticated version of it, several others kind of standard psychology tests and personality profiles. And so I seemed to have scored where they wanted with that. And they took me over, Tom particularly did. And I have to paint a little bit of a picture here. Tom, it's kind of interesting because neither Skip nor Tom wore uniforms, military uniforms, and yet they were in military quarters with their rank and their name on the door. Okay, so Captain McNair and Captain Atwater. Tom had a full beard and wore jeans and button-down shirt all the time. Yeah. And I'm thinking, well, that's not typical. Some human intelligence folks, the spies, the typical spies, sometimes they had relaxed grooming standards and wore civilian clothes, but Tom didn't seem to be one of those. And, so that was odd. But anyway, Tom takes me over to their offices, which are beat up old World War II temporary buildings. Perfect cover, I have to tell you. And sat me down in the back and said, okay, so we collect intelligence against, first of all, I had to sign this NDA. We call it a read-on statement in the military, but an NDA that was really more severe than anything I'd signed for top secret compartmented intelligence. And Tom says, we collect intelligence against foreign threats using a parapsychology discipline known as remote viewing. We're essentially inviting you to volunteer to become a psychic spy. And he said, no, you don't have to tell me today. You have 24 hours to think it over. These are the 3 things you can tell your wife about it. And blah,
that is
blah, blah.
way cooler than any invitation I've ever received in my entire life.
Well, and me too, other than that one time. So anyway.
That's not like we're having a Tupperware party. Why don't you come over and do some burping?
Hey, although that would be fun too. Well, anyway, and Tom, they were used to people either turning them down or saying, I got to think about that. That's too weird. As soon as he was finished talking, I said, where do I sign? And Tom looked a little surprised because he was, what, you're already ready? You haven't even thought about it. Well, as he's talking, I'm thinking, I used to be interested in ESP. I was in the science fair project. I was really fascinated by it. He's telling me there's a line item in the federal budget that pays people to learn how to do this. That means it's real. There's no way in hell I'm not going to do this.
Yeah, that's like a dream come true, I imagine, right?
A very surprising dream come true.
Yeah. Well, you wrote a book called "Reading the Enemy's Mind," and the person who wrote the foreword for the book was the Washington Post columnist. Was it Jack Anderson? Is that right?
Yes, Jack Anderson.
Now, that book, since you came out with that book, you have released another book recently. Is that right?
Yes.
And
a few years back, yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about the difference between that book, the recent book, and the previous book, Reading the Enemy's Mind?
Yes. So Reading the Enemy's Mind, I hesitate to call it a history because that tends to turn people off, and this book is much more than a history. Reading the Enemy's Mind is an account of the remote viewing program from its beginning to its end. I was in, of course, 7 years of that 23 years, but I had access to just about anybody I needed to talk to over the entire length of the program. I had interviews with 50 of the main players for that to capture the parts that I wasn't there for, plus a lot of documentation that was available that I knew where it was and most people didn't, right? But in the book, I also tell a lot about remote viewing itself, the process, that kind of thing, and a lot of the things we accomplished with it, and some of our failures. So the book is a history, but it's much more than a history. The second book, The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing, is aimed at people who have either don't know what remote viewing is or have just now learned about it and don't know much about it. Uh-huh. It's kind of like a survey course, but written in an interesting way that explains what remote viewing is, talks about how it fits into the psychic world in general, talks about what we know about how it works, talks about different kinds of remote viewing, offers a tutorial and a couple of simple experiments that you can do it yourself, talks about what to look for in an instructor, because not all instructors are created equal. There's a whole bunch of people out there who offer to teach remote viewing who don't really know what it is themselves. You have to kind of be careful out there in the world today. And just an overall very extended discussion. It even shows evidence. I have 2 chapters on the evidence why we believe remote viewing is real. So overall, it's a book to learn about remote viewing. The first book is to learn where it came from and some of the aspects and elements of it that are and the stories that surround it.
Paul, you mentioned just before some successes and failures. I wonder if you could just briefly highlight. I'm very curious about a success without spoiling your book.
Yeah. Well, it wouldn't. There's so much in that book that I could tell you a number of things and it wouldn't spoil it. So,
well, great.
I'll tell you a very obvious one.
Resist spoilage. I like that.
Spoilage, yeah. So, a very obvious one, and it's probably the best ever remote viewing session I ever did. So one day I get approached. This is May of 1987. I get approached by one of our operations officers who says, come on, let's go do a session. And I'm thinking this is a real-world session. It turns out he was doing a kind of a practice session that was just one-off. But he phrased the tasking, which I didn't get. I just got the number, of course. But the tasking I found out later was describe the most important thing for us to know about in the next few days. That was I don't know the exact wording, but that was the sense of it. So I get the number. My subconscious goes out and says, well, what is this about? Finds out it's a future, we call those a future fishing expedition. See if we can find out something about the future. And so I proceed to describe this vessel sailing through a body of water that was surrounded by land on all sides. It was dark. It was at night. The vessel reminded me of a U.S. destroyer sailing on. Then I get a perception of an aircraft off in the distance. And I'm shortening this up dramatically, right? The aircraft drops these 2 cylindrical objects with little short stubby wings that make guttering, roaring sounds. These cylindrical objects kind of fly around a little aimlessly, and then they home in on this vessel. And they hit it, and there's all kinds of smoke and mayhem and all this kind of stuff. And the vessel leans to one side like it's listing, like it might be sinking, and then my monitor, who it turned out I was describing something he had not at all expected. This was a clear case of double blind. There's no way he could have influenced this. He says, well, where did this come from? And I described the aircraft coming from a airfield on the edge of the water, but is being controlled from a third world city that was far inland. I could tell it was third world because it had like lots of flat roof buildings and there were draft animals in the streets and stuff. And it was run by a military, which was kind of sloppy, and I described their uniforms and stuff. Okay, so I tell all this stuff to him. And he says, well, I think you're off. We're just going to quit there. Okay. So I put this session, my transcript, in my safe drawer and go home for the weekend. Monday morning, I get a phone call from Skip Outwater. He says, Paul, where's that session that you did on Friday? And I said, well, it's in my safe drawer. Why do you care? I was off. He says, you haven't seen the papers today yet, have you? I said, no. I opened up the Washington Post. Above the fold story, U.S. frigate, which is a small destroyer, hit by Exocet missiles fired by an Iraqi jet. in the Persian Gulf. And I'm reading this story, and it's matching point by point everything I said in that session. But
Wow.
I did the session 50 hours before it happened.
So I would like to know what
amazing.
was your feeling when you read that, as you read that?
Well, I was kind of stunned. I'm going, what the heck, And they wanted me to come in and write up a quick summary of what I'd reported to send up the food chain in the intelligence world up to DIA headquarters, and so I did that. But I was kind of startled and surprised, but in a way I wasn't surprised because we'd had similarly accurate things in the past, not as dramatic as this, of course, mixed in with where the ones we just totally missed, but we'd had similar and accurate ones on other targeting. And so I was startled, I was stunned, I was surprised, but I wasn't surprised by it. So interestingly, I was working on my master's degree in strategic intelligence down at the Defense Intelligence Agency's school, and it was a part-time thing. And about a year later, I took an indications and warning course, and one of their texts was the after-action report on this attack. It was the ship was the USS Stark, and this is the after-action report to tell everybody what happened and how it went wrong, which the Navy does that. If something like this happens, they research the heck out of it. And I'm reading this after-action report, and I have my transcript, and I'm going through it. I'm seeing everything I said in there was correct, and nothing that I said was incorrect. Now, obviously, there's more detail in the after-action report, but still, my session matched it up, except for one thing. In my session, I'd reported on multi-engine aircraft off in the distance monitoring this event, and I had not read anything in the papers about that. In the after-action report, it said there was a Saudi AWACS that was desperately trying to get F-15s in to intercept the Iraqi jet, but it was too late. So even that part of my session was right that I thought I had just gotten wrong. It was stunning. I've never had a session that good since, and I don't know why that one was. I guess just because of the need. Unfortunately, it didn't do any good because we thought that I was off. My monitor was sure I was off, and so we filed it away. We didn't report it, so we didn't have an impact except after the fact, which is sad because I think 37 American sailors died in that in that event.
Yep.
So.
Wow. I'm curious as well. So you get the invitation. You say yes immediately before you're over. Yeah, before they finish the sentence, right? So between that and beginning this practice, what's the training like? I'm picturing that opening scene in Ghostbusters, like you mentioned earlier, where it's Bill Murray shocking you because he doesn't think you're attractive.
Yeah. So it was, it would not be exciting. It would be like watching paint dry if you were an observer. But
that's boring.
It was like, well, if you were doing it, you didn't find it boring, So we got our theory lectures from Ingo Swann, and of course Hal Puthoff was involved as well. And Ingo would lecture to us and present the process, the theory behind it, and then the why you do what you do in this, and then how you implement that why. And give us the book learning, you could call it, and then we would do various kinds of practical exercises and stuff to kind of get a feel for the process, and then the only thing you can do is give the viewers blind targets and see how they do. There is of course, just like in any other skill learning, a lot of trial and error. You get things wrong, you get things right. You start to compare what you got, how you got things right, how you got them wrong, and you get better as you train and practice. And so ultimately the only way to do it is to put a person in a situation where they either have to be psychic or they fail. There's nothing in between, right? And so that was kind of how it went.
Well, no, you gave that example right there. That's an exceptionally good example. There is a film that you were involved with Ben Kingsley that it actually has remote viewing as part of the story. And you were asked to be, what was your role in Suspect Zero?
In the film itself, nothing. My involvement came afterwards when they were doing the bonus features for the DVD. The movie itself, you had Ben Kingsley, Aaron Eckert, Carrie Moss, and some other folks. And it was an interesting film, and I actually liked it. I mean, it was a serial killer film, and it incorporated remote viewing, and people can watch it. If you get the DVD, I'm in the bonus features, and I'll tell you that story. So the film really got hammered by the critics. It wasn't because it was a bad film; it's because it was about remote viewing, and the critics couldn't believe that it was real. And so, it was disappointing that they were so narrow-minded about it. But the Elias Marriage, the director, he wants to bring this up on people's radar more, and so he went and interviewed Russell Targ, for example, who was one of the scientists at SRI International in charge of the program, and he he came to me and asked if I would do a demonstration session and do an interview. And so he comes to Austin. I was living in Austin at the time. Comes to Austin, and he says, "Okay, would you rather do the interview or the demo first? I don't want you to be tired for the demo." And I said, "No, it doesn't matter." And he said, "Well, why not?" And I said, "Because I'm not going to do the demo." And I see his eyes get big, like, "Hey, I spent all this money to come out here, and you're not going to do it after all?" I said, "No, I'm not going to do the demo. You are."
Oh.
And he goes, "What? I can't do this stuff?" And I said, "Sure you can." And I had already negotiated with Hal Putoff. Hal lives in Austin these days, and back then he and I, I took my students to his lab every time I taught a class to get a lecture from him, and I arranged with Hal to be the monitor of Elias Marriage doing this experiment. And then this was what we call an outbounder, where you have a couple of people who have been introduced to the viewer, and then they are randomly assigned a target, and they go to that location without the viewer having any idea where they went. And then the viewer's task is to try and go out into the ether and find those people and describe their surroundings. We call that an outbounder or a beacon experiment. And you need a monitor to kind of help you stay on track and all that kind of stuff. And so Hal monitored Elias Marriage. And so I and Jamie, I got one of our family friends who'd been a house sitter for us. I got her to come along, and we went out to this target, which turned out to be Pennybacker Bridge over Lake Austin there on the west side of Austin. We went to the bridge and we walked around it, and we touched it. We did whatever we could to make it a kind of a vivid experience for us and for the viewer. And Elias is back there with Hal, and neither one of them know what the target is, and we're talking distance maybe 10 miles. And Elias proceeds to sketch a lot of the stuff we were looking at and to describe it in specific terms. There was stuff he couldn't put it together, but he described a lot of actual accurate details about it. And so then we're in the car driving out to the target, because the second part of the protocol is you take the viewer to the actual location so they get real feedback about the target. Okay, and so we've got him in the car. He still doesn't know where we're going. I have the camera guy sit in the front seat and aim the camera into the back and keep the camera on Elias. And see, Elias doesn't know what's going on. I just set it up that way, and we're driving down the road, and he looks up ahead, probably about a mile and a half up. You can see the bridge up over the roadway. He says, he's talking about something else, and then he sees that out of the corner of his eye. He turns, looks, and says, "That's the target! That's the target!" He's so excited. He's there on film, That's the target. He's just actually blown away. And we get there and we walk around, and it's like his feet aren't even touching the ground. He's so excited about the outcome of this. And so, so that's the part that's in the bonus features for the DVD.
Very, very interesting. Well,
very cool.
I am asking that because I'm not trying to ask leading questions, but I have on your website you are an instructor and you do teach, and like you said in your books, you certainly inform about the history of remote viewing and your autobiographical experience and your work with a number of these other gentlemen who you were involved with at Fort Meade, like Joe McMoneagle and other folks. There is I'm looking at our time, and we've got a little bit of time left, a few minutes, but there are a couple things I would really like to see if we could touch on. And the first one is has to do with Dr. William Tiller, and then it has to do with when I think about remote viewing, it's occurring. If remote viewing is truly, in fact, real, then it is occurring in reality. It's occurring in the universe, and therefore, in some sense, it could be described as a kind of remote influencing. Could it not?
Well, I tend to prefer to keep those two terms separate because usually people mean something different by them. So remote viewing, I look at as a passive information collecting methodology. Right, so it's like a clandestine intelligence collector who goes out and collects information that, and you don't want the person the enemy to know that you've even collected that information. You're trying to be as uninvasive as possible.
Right,
that's the goal. Right, whereas remote influencing is more like covert operations, and there's a difference between covert and clandestine. So covert operations is where you actually go out and try and negatively affect the enemy. Now, of course, it could also be a positive effect, right? But you go out and in remote influencing, you're trying to influence somebody or something at the target or whatever, right? And so there really are two different things, and I really don't like to get them mixed up because people tend to grab a hold of it and run and come to conclusions that aren't warranted. So remote influencing is, so in a very general sense, it is real. It's just another version of psychokinesis, which is mind over matter, causing things to move with your mind, bending spoons and silverware and that kind of thing with your mind, that kind of stuff. And there's been a lot of research that shows there's a reality to that phenomenon, although not nearly to the extent that people claim, right? And so I prefer to keep those separate, but go ahead.
Well, okay. Part of, I'm going to see if I can tie these things together. Yesterday, when Ben and I were having a conversation, we were recording another episode of this program, we got to talking about heart math and the way in which the research from heart math indicates that an individual can be influential upon another individual by using the heart math techniques. My understanding is that Dr. William Tiller, who some folks probably know him from the documentaries of What the Bleep, that came out a number of years ago, that there's he spent a great deal of time studying intention and influencing through a kind of focused meditation. He was, I think, the head of material science engineering at Stanford, but during those decades when he was doing that work, he was also doing experiments in influence. One of the ones that I remember was having 4 meditators sit around a table, and they had I think it's an EID, electromagnetic intention imprintable device. And the experiment was to see if they could influence the pH value of a test tube or beaker of water by something like exactly 1.0. And in that experiment, they were able to do that without ever touching the object, and I believe the object was actually kept in a Faraday cage. You are familiar with Dr. Tiller? Did you know him?
I met him. He was a keynote speaker at one of our conferences that I organized, and so I knew him. Ingo Swann really thought a lot of Bill Tiller.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I know he's involved in a lot of this research. And what he was doing essentially was a version of what was called DMILS, direct mental influence over living systems, except that in this case it didn't involve living systems. So there's a whole research body. William Broad was one of the main folks, but there are other people involved where they would... like, for example, Rupert Sheldrake writes about the sense of people being stared at, right? And that's yes. Well, that's one of the explanations. Yeah. The actual empirical effect is measurable to some degree. So, whatever its causation is, right? So, that's an example of direct mental influence over living systems. Is where you stare at somebody and you get a statistically significant result from those experiments. And there are other forms of DMILS. And then it moves into the PK world, which was pioneered by the PEAR lab, PEAR lab at Princeton University, where they did all kinds of PK experiments and produced statistically significant results. And all of this is of a piece of some kind of remote influence, whether over a biological system or over inanimate systems. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest this is a real thing. There is probably not as robust of evidence as we have for remote viewing, but it's still pretty strong. And it's the only problem again is we don't know what the causal mechanism is. People, you can read a lot about these experiments in my dissertation, which is online. It's a little too complicated to tell you here, but maybe if you have show notes or something, I can give you the link.
Is it rviewer.com? Is that your domain name? rviewer.com?
Yeah, rviewer.com.
Okay.
And if you go into the About section and find my bio, I link my dissertation from my bio in the About section.
Okay.
So for listeners, out there who are interested, and I'd like you. This is, I guess, the second part of my earlier question.
Mm-hmm.
What are you up to now? Are you teaching? Are you for hire? Are you?
Yes. The answer is I do teach. That's my main thing. I feel like it's important to pass this on to a new generation so that I can someday retire. Right? So I teach. That's my main thing. I write books. I do interviews like this. I do a lot of outreach. I don't do the operations myself, in other words, use it for real world things anymore. I used to do it a lot, but it's very time consuming, and I don't have that kind of time anymore. I'm 72 and I'm counting down, right? So I have other people who do operations. In fact, I just passed one along to one of my folks today, as a matter of fact. So, but yeah, I'm doing all that, and obviously rviewer.com, my website, is where you find out about it. Now, I'm kind of on hold right now because I've got to have shoulder surgery in a couple of weeks, and that's going to lay me up. I don't know when I'll get back to training, but hopefully within a couple of months. So, yeah.
Well, with that said, we are coming right up on the top of the hour.
Yep.
And Paul, will you come back again and talk with Ben and myself some more? We've got lots of things that we would love to talk with you about and continue exploring this
Absolutely
fascinating topic. All right. Well,
an hour is definitely not enough time to talk about all this.
Okay.
True enough.
All right. Well, I am Robert Doc Barham, and
I'm Benjamin Cooke.
And also, before we go, I want to mention two gentlemen who are friends of mine and friends of Paul's who wanted to say hi to you as well. Zoe Williams from his radio program says hello, and his Voice of Reason program on KBLA in Los Angeles. And also producer Scott Goldie from The Unexplained with William Shatner said to say hello to you as well.
Well, yeah, I need to get on that show.
I'd like to see you on there too. We'll call Scott after this show. Thank you guys very much. Thank you folks for listening and tuning in, and we will see you all again very, very soon. Have a good night.
Thank you, Paul. Please stay out of my bedroom.
Don't worry, you're boring.